Hi, this YouTube video is part one of a talk I gave at Binghamton University to a group of computer science majors in November of this year, 2014. The topic is Essence. Essence is a new object management group standard, just came out in June of this year. And if you're new to Essence, this is a great place to start. It's about 44 minutes. And if you don't have time to look at the whole thing, jump to the back end and you'll find a cross-reference to where in the video you can find 23 key topics. Thank you. Hope you enjoy it.
So, getting started, what is Essence? Essence is, first off, a thinking framework. So, when I say this is a thinking framework, if I said that to new developers or developers that are out there, that should get you thinking differently about this model, because that's not been used with other models or processes that people have been given in the past. Like I mentioned Lean Six Sigma. I went through it's about 250 hours of study and then a 5-hour timed examination to get my Lean Six Sigma black belt. This helps me as a process professional. I go into organizations after being a developer for 24 years. The last 15 years I'm now helping. I go into organizations and I use these techniques I learned to help companies by kind of looking at their projects from the outside. And what I like to say about Essence is this is the first model that I know of, and it's part of the reason we built it, which is a model that's not intended for consultants. It's a model that's intended for software practitioners to look at their project from the inside and to help themselves be more effective. So that's a big difference in the model. Scrum is also a framework. So some people might come back and say, when I go, well, Essence is the first model to help teams. Well, what about Scrum? Scrum is a framework and it's a model that is intended for teams to use, and it's a very good one. Merwin also mentioned I'm a Scrum Master. I help a lot of teams with Scrum. But here's the difference between Scrum and Essence. Scrum is a really nice set of practices that tell teams that what you want to do is you want to plan your sprints. And you want to plan your work efforts in small iterations, like 30 days. And you want to have daily stand-up meetings so the team can talk and they can share their, what's getting in their way, and they can share their progress. And then at the end, you do demonstrations. And you get together and do a retrospective, because in the retrospective, the team talks about how they can get better. These are all good practices. But if you look at Scrum, it doesn't go any further into helping the team, one, in those daily stand-ups, how do I assess how far along I'm at? How do I assess how much work I still have to go? In those retrospectives, it doesn't tell you anymore for where to look for problems, where to look for issues. Essence is about helping you in those areas, helping you understand where you might be able to find those kinds of problems. So, Essence contains 7 alphas. Alphas are the essential things we work with. Alphas always exist. Now, another thing we did when we built this model was we wanted to use natural language. We wanted to use terminology that a software developer, a software practitioner would know, so you don't have to go out and learn a bunch of other words. So the alphas, what you're going to see, and you're going to see on my next slide this blown up, and we're going to talk to it quite a bit so you can kind of get into the model. But you're going to see words that all should sound familiar to you, because there's 7 alphas, and they're words like stakeholders, opportunity, software system, requirements. These ought to all sound familiar to you, not new words we're making up. Team, work, way of working. Now those 7 that I just said, they always exist. There are always stakeholders. There's always a software system. There's always requirements. There's always a team. The team always has a way of working. There's always work to do. Natural word. So some people go, why did you create that funny term alpha? Since all these are natural words, why did you come up with this other strange word? Well, originally, alpha was kind of abstract work product. That's the way people thought about it. But we learned that that's not a good way to think of it. And the reason we wanted to keep the term, we actually thought about dropping it. We got, no, we need to keep it because there's something different going on here. And we don't want people to miss it. One of the problems with other models, when we just started looking at work products, because there's always work products associated with things. There, there's requirements documents, and there's design documents, and there's test cases. And so there's all kinds of products related to software development, code. But when you get focused, too focused on the work product, you frequently miss the goal. And the whole idea of essence is that we're trying to get back to the goal. It's all about helping teams be successful. It's not a theoretical model. You'll hear me say that again. It's about helping teams be successful. And the other thing that's different about this model, people go, well, it's 7 alphas. You just told me the words. We all know they're there. How's that going to help me? While the alphas are always there, alphas have states and checklists, and those are not always there. This is the discriminator, because this is where it gives you help to see where you are and where you might have some risks. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And as we do, I'm going to pull out the cards. So the first thing I like to say to this is think of the alphas as the dashboard of your car. Right? You got all these indicators out there to help you know where you're at when you're driving the car. You got your fuel gauge. You got your speedometer. All right? So the alphas are like your software project dashboard. They're indicators to help you know where you're healthy and maybe where you have some risk or where you have some trouble. The alphas are broken up into 3 areas of concern that are color-coded. The top area of concern is called the customer area. And in the customer area, you have the stakeholders and you have opportunity. They always exist. There always has to be an opportunity. Opportunity is a need. If there isn't a need for a software system, nobody's going to fund it, and you're never going to get out and build it. All right? There's always some kind of need. Even in cases where it's R&D, somebody's willing to fund it, sometimes to build something in hopes that someone will need it, but those are risk takers. That happens. They're willing to fund it, so there's a need to do that. So there's always a need. There's always stakeholders. Stakeholders are the people who are affected by the software system or affect it. So team members are actually part of the stakeholders. They affect it. But anybody else that can use it is a stakeholder. Software system. This is what most of you as software developers know best. You know what the software system is. Something's going to... Software system, by the way, is more than just software. As I mentioned before, this is about helping you be successful. A software system includes hardware and data, because software by itself isn't going to do much good. It's got to run on hardware to give value to someone. Right? So software system is a system made up of software, hardware, and data that derives its primary value from the execution of the software. And I'm actually giving you the definition that's in these cards here. And I'll open this up in a minute. Requirements is what the software system must do to meet the needs, the opportunity of the stakeholders. There's always a team. The team are the people that are going to build the software system. And they always have work to do to build the software system. This work, for a while, was called project. But as the group of us that put this model together started talking, we realized that all software doesn't happen in the context of a project, but there's always work. So sometimes there's a group of people that are just maintaining software. It's not on a project. One of the things we tried to do was build this model so that it was applicable to any kind of software, large, small. We wanted to keep the model very small so that practitioners could quickly learn it in school, keep it in their head and use it. So we needed to keep it small. It's not everything you need, but it's the essence of what you need, whether you're on a small software project, a huge complex software project. All of the things, all of the alphas are essential. And that was one of our criteria for putting this together. So that's why the name, we moved to work. There's always work. There's always a team. The team always has a way of working, whether it's documented or not. So we're very careful not to say, here, a process. Because sometimes people think of process as a documented process. And as we talked, we said some companies and some environments, they have a way of working. We actually gave a presentation of this recently at Google to a bunch of software developers at Google. And these guys, this company, Google, is run bottom up. And most of their processes aren't written down, but they know what they're doing. They're very good at what they do. They have a way of working. Right? So point being, depending on the experience level and the nature of the work you're doing, your way of working may be documented formally or it may not, but there's always a way of working. The way of working is how you do the work, how the team does that. So let me talk a little bit about the cards, just so you know what's in this deck, because then later I'll explain some games that teams can play with this. So if you open up the deck of cards, the first card here is this diagram. It's just the big model. And then what we have is we have 7 cards, which are the alpha definition cards. So there's a card for each of the alphas that I just talked about. And on there's the actual definition. I gave you a few of them. And what I didn't talk about yet is also what's on there are the states for each alpha. So each alpha has a set of states. Let me just pick stakeholders here. And by the way, it turned out, and we didn't try to do this intentionally. Again, we brainstormed, so what makes sense? We wanted the states to be universal. Always exists, regardless of whether you're doing a, you guys know that, you learned about Agile, you learned about iterative, so I hope you know about most projects today use some form of iterative development, but some use what's called a waterfall model. You've been through some? Okay. So with the waterfall model, you would only go through the major phases once, as opposed to iterating in small chunks. So you would try to do all your requirements up front, for example. So the point is, we wanted to make sure anything we put in our states would be applicable to any kind of software development and any life cycle. And I'm going to give an example on how you would apply this, because some people get confused with model. They think, this state stuff makes it sound waterfallish. You're giving me a structure, I go through states, it sounds like it's a waterfall, and it isn't. It works fine with Agile, it works fine with Scrum, and I'm going to give an example shortly. But it turned out that almost all the alphas have 6 states, only by accident. We didn't try to get to 6. One of them has 5. But just to give you one, stakeholders, the 6 states are recognized, represented, involved, in agreement, satisfied for deployment, satisfied in use. You're going to see this again later in one of the games. I just want to give you a high level on it now. And then after those 7 cards, we have for each state, we have an abbreviated set of checklists. And the checklists, this is where the value comes in, because the checklists are the reminders, and they stimulate the discussion to say, okay, have we achieved this state? Well, have we achieved this checklist? Okay? So the checklists are the things that really took us a long time to develop. And there's a full set of them in the OMG standard. We just put an abbreviated set on the cards, which are kind of reminders for you. So for every state, we've got in the cards the checklist. That gives you a sense for what's in the cards. I want to give a quick example that I just referred to help show how essence states are not waterfall. And this also is a nice example that shows how our volunteers interact when we get together every week. Because volunteers come and go. There have been some of the people, like myself, who have been involved from the beginning in building the standard. And then we have some volunteers that are there for a while, then they get busy in their job, they have to leave, other new ones come in. This was just over the summertime. We had some new volunteers in, and they were looking at the work alpha, and they were looking at the work started state. And in the meeting, they said, you know, these checklists, and this is just a subset of the checklist that I put up here, these checklists are out of order. And I immediately responded and I said, there is no order, because we didn't want to make an order because that would sound too much like a method, and we want to work for any method. And then the response was, yeah, but some things have a natural order. And when things have a natural order, and you don't put them in the natural order, it looks disorganized. And the example he was referring to is right here. It goes, you know, the work is being broken down. Okay, well, you got to break the work down before development work starts, and then before you progress the work. So yeah, you're right. It does look out of order. So let's look a little closer at this. And what we did is we then looked at the previous state, work prepared. And it's interesting because, now we see another checklist item over in work prepared that looks kind of redundant with this checklist item. In prepared, we have the work is broken down sufficiently for productive work to start. And when we did this, it rang a bell in my head, and I go, okay, I remember what we were doing here. So we were thinking, how can people use this as a thinking framework? How can a team use it to think through their issues, to figure out where they're at, regardless of the method they're using? So let's assume you're a Scrum team, all right? And a Scrum team says, okay, have we prepared the work? Well, to prepare the work needs to be broken down sufficiently. And by the way, there's a lot of terms in here that sound ambiguous, and it's intentional. Sufficiently sounds like an ambiguous word. You're also going to see the phrase agreed to. And it's like, well, and the question's always good, is agreed to by who? And how do I know if it's sufficient? And this goes back to the whole idea, it's a thinking framework. We're giving you just enough for you as a team to stimulate your discussion and to get you to decide. So sufficiently depends on your environment. Now, let's talk about Scrum. Teams decided they're going to use Scrum. The work is broken down sufficiently for productive work to start. What that means is you've got a backlog of work in Scrum, and the team has broken down enough of it that they know the work they can do over the first 30 days. That's sufficiently for a Scrum team. So the next step is, let's see if the work is started. Well, if the developers are now working on it, and then if they're holding their daily stand-up meetings, they're monitoring the work, and then at the end of the 30 days, they do the demonstration, and now they go back and they break work down again. The work is being broken down into action work items with a clear definition of done. Then the Scrum team can easily say, Our work is started. We're hitting all these. Now let's go to the waterfall model for a moment. If a team decided they were going to do waterfall, and that same team had broken down work sufficiently for the first 30 days, they might deem that's not sufficient. Because as a waterfall model, I need to understand the requirements better because I'm only going through it once. So what you can see here is how a team can use this as a thinking framework to decide where they are based on their own context. You pick your life cycle, and this is kind of the theme that runs through all of these. The team has to use these to figure out where they're at.
It's like goal-oriented, and then as opposed to Scrum, which is scheduling-oriented, kind of.
Scrum is practice-oriented. Scrum gives you a set of very good proven practices for the team because it says do things like hold a daily stand-up. All right? It says things like plan your work in 30-day increments. So those are real practices. So Essence has no practices in it. We don't tell you when to hold your meetings or what kind of meetings to hold, but we give you checklists and we give you these states and these alphas that are kind of universal checkpoints that do help you, getting back to your point, that do help you say, are we really achieving the goal of heading to a successful project, regardless of what life cycle we're using? Did that get to your question? Okay.
It's something that you use alongside.
Great comment. The phrase we're using, and I've actually written, I mentioned to Merwin, I've written some papers that are coming out in the next few months. Is actually, I have one in Crosstalk, the Journal of Defense Software Engineering. It's coming out in the January-February issue. And one of the things that we're saying and we're writing papers on is how Essence can power other methods. So your comment, use alongside or complementary, is absolutely right on. And the message we're sending, somebody goes, well, why would I want to do this? It helps you, it powers your method, whatever you're doing. Right. So yes, good comment. Other questions? The chunk of work you apply the model to is up to you. That's essentially what that's saying. We've had where a lot of the problems when you go in, I'm as a consultant, so I get called into troubled projects. Why did this project go astray? You know, it started out good, we had a good goal, and we're floundering, we're not getting there. Well, oftentimes, they come back to little things. I mean, usually when I go in and I look, it's not a major technological problem. It's like the team wasn't talking to each other, or we didn't have people with the right skills. They weren't trained properly. Or we really never had a common vision. I mean, it's really fundamental stuff, which is what the fundamentals are you're going to see in the checklists. They're getting you to think about those key kinds of things. And the point that I try to make here is that we never gave developers, in all the work we've done, I've been involved in this business for 40 years, you know, all the things we've done, we've never given developers a framework to help them really go back and check if they're achieving the goal. So that's a big, again, complementary. It works with you. How states are different. You don't always move forward linearly. How a team uses this is up to you. I mean, you can, you know, with how frequently you pull the cards out and play some of the games I'm going to talk to you about, that's up to you. But you definitely want to do it frequently because you can fall back. You can achieve a state and then later on find out you're no longer achieving it. How checklists differ. I like to use the phrase that a lot of the checklists you see in a lot of companies and organizations that use models like the CMMI have what I call existence checks. And it's kind of check the box thing. It's like, do you have a plan? Did you perform your peer review? Did you do your testing? Check, done, check, done. But existence checks don't really tell you how much more work you have or how well you're doing. And so what we tried to do in our checklists is get more into those kinds of things to help you assess better. How much more work do I really have to do? Now let me give some examples of this. And these I did talk to last April. The requirements, one of the states is Coherent. And one of the checklist items in the Coherent state is conflicting requirements are identified and attended to. Now if you think about that, just verifying that you have a document, which typical checklist, a lot of companies, do I have a requirements document? Check. But having a document is not the same as looking inside the document and finding out if there's ambiguous requirements in there or if it's unclear. Are you working the issues? And the reason that's important is that's what really gets in the way of a lot of developers. When you have ambiguous, conflicting requirements, you can't get questions answered because your stakeholders are not available. This is what, and again, when you're assessing progress, somebody goes, are you almost done? Well, this is a large part of what drives issues and difficulties for teams. So what we try to do is put those kind of checklists in here that really get deeper at to where you're really at in your progress. Let me give some more examples. Stakeholders in agreement. Checklist item. And some people misunderstand this. By the way, when you look at a state, you might think you know what it means, but you really want to read the checklists because this doesn't mean all the stakeholders are completely in agreement because usually that's not realistic. I mean, most of the time when you're building a software system, you're going to have stakeholders with their own view of what they want the system to do, and somebody's got to get them together and balance their needs. Right? So one of the checklist items is the stakeholder representatives, and I'll talk more about representatives shortly, but the stakeholder representatives agree with how their different priorities and perspectives are being balanced to provide clear direction for the team. That wording, you want to think about that. That's very powerful wording. It took us a long time, a lot of discussion to get the wording right. Root of many troubled projects is unclear direction to the team. The team's getting pulled. You're freaking, when I go in and I look at problems and I go, what's happened here? Talk to 3 developers and they're all thinking, I'm getting told by so-and-so that I need to be heading down this path while my buddy's going down that path and our software's not going to talk. That's the root. We didn't get together with a clear vision and balance the needs. Team formed. A team is more than a group of people. It's very important that you have a healthy team. You can move through the states. Team members to be formed, which is an early state in team members understand their responsibilities and how they align with their competencies. Get the team to talk about this. We know what we have to do. Hey, do we have all the people with the right competencies? And by the way, sometimes the question comes up, and it came up last April when I did this, how do competencies and skills tie together? Competencies are a little bit higher level than skills. For example, you can be a competent programmer, but do you have the right programming skill for this project? Right? But skills are important because you start with competencies. Do we have programmers here that can get this job done? But then the team goes, okay, we've chosen to use C++ or Java. Do we have people who know the language we chose? So it gets you to ask both of those questions. Root of many troubled projects is traceable to competency issues. Often you don't have all the right people with the domain knowledge as well. Our software system, one of the early states, is architecture selected. The root of many troubled projects is, we get out there and we're trying to sell to the customer that, yeah, we're doing well. We're going to give an early demonstration. And there's this inclination to demonstrate what looks good rather than, what's the essence of what we need in this architecture to address the risks so that we really get to the end goal. So here, architecture, not just check the box, do I have an architecture, but architecture selected that addresses agreed to, there's that phrase, key technical risks. So the team needs to ask, agreed to by who? Who are the key people that need to be looking at the risks? What are the risks from the stakeholders' viewpoint? Not just the team. The team is a stakeholder, but there's other stakeholders. What are the agreed to risks? And have we selected an architecture that addresses them? This drives you to make sure you get that architecture right up front, for not just one I can demonstrate quick, but one that really gets to the goal. So that's an example of what, again, getting back to that point, this is getting you to think about the goal.
The process you would go through, where, and it sounds like it's adding more definition to that state, right?
The checklists really, they really clarify what the state means. To get to the state, you have to pass all the checklists. Actually, this is good we're asking the question because I can go quicker with other slides when they come. But to pass a given state, you have to be able to say you've met all the checklists. If there's one checklist you didn't meet, the team goes, okay, we're not there yet. All right? Now, you have to have the conversation and decide how important that is in your context. But that is the criteria. You meet all the checklists to get to the state. The states do tend to make people think of waterfall, but this is again a thinking framework. So you apply it within your context. So you can apply it in an iterative fashion, right? And the idea and the reason that's important is you can get in trouble with iterative. I mean, waterfall has taken on a bad name these days. Everybody says because we applied it incorrectly. There were good things in waterfall. It is still good to have criteria for completing things. I heard Merwin talk about doing the Gantt charts, and you need to know when you're done, at whatever level of granularity you're working at, right? So that idea of having criteria to know when you're done with things is still a good idea in any model. And that's the idea here with our checklists, but you apply it to the aspect of work, the granularity of work that fits with your life cycle. Yes?
So now this is a little bit straying off the waterfall thing. Well, when let's say you're when you complete all the stuff on the checklist on the state, is there, and you're done with that state, is there a point possibly that you could go back to that state, maybe you missed something?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, I got examples here that say, and I'll just mention some now, so we can go quicker later. You can easily fall back in a state. You can get, I talk about the team being formed. Well, then later the team is collaborating as another state. And then the team is working well, and there's checklists. But things can happen. You can have a team that's collaborating or working well, and some of the team members quit. Or you can have new team members come, and they're not playing as well and collaborating. So you can fall back in any state. And so that's why you need to be applying the model regularly, all right?
Like, is there a certain kind of order to the states that you go through, or can you be working towards like all 6 states and like whichever one you just finished first?
Great question. To achieve a state, again, you have to achieve all the checklists. But we're not saying, and we don't want people to think, I have to just rigidly work towards those items and nothing else. Not true. Frequently, you're working towards checklists in later states at the same time that you're working towards this one. So,
But there is an order?
There is an order.
Okay.
There is an order. And the order is a natural order that, and we had a lot of discussion with, it's a natural order that we see that all software development goes through. And another point I want to make on this one is, in your context, you may look at some of the checklists and say, this is not essential for me. And the team can do that, and they can go, all right, we can just say not applicable and move on. And one of the examples I like to give on that is with stakeholders. There's a checklist in there which says the stakeholders are happy with their involvement on the project. And we go, people would naturally go, well, why do the stakeholders need to be happy? Well, obviously they don't, right? And so it's not essential from that aspect. But what is essential is if you have unhappy stakeholders, the team should talk about that and at least discuss why that stakeholder is unhappy, and if it could be a risk. Because if it's a key stakeholder and they're unhappy, it could be a real risk to your project. Now, it could be for a lot of reasons, and you talk about it quick and there's nothing you can do about it, and you just say, let's move on. But so some of these checklists are intended that way for you to talk about, because it could be a problem, but then you and your contacts decide whether it's worth putting any energy into. Right? So 15 activity spaces. And you know, activity spaces are the essential things we do. In order to progress in alpha, you have to do something. Right? There's always activity. But we don't tell you what the activities are. These are like generic containers. Because, again, we're methodology, we're independent. We're not trying to tell you what it is. Why do we have activity spaces? First of all, you don't have to use them. A lot of people can just use the model with the cards and the alphas and never do this. But some companies like to express their practices. And I'll mention this later, but you can create practices, and we have a guide on how you do it, and the practices sit on top of the basic essentials. And your practices should help you move the alphas forward. So some organizations, because of the nature of their work, they want to specify how you do the work, the activities involved. And others, it can be more tacit, like I mentioned at Google. People know what they're doing. They don't need it written down so much. So we don't tell you how much, you know, whether you have to specify the activities or not. But the activity spaces are the types of activities that you need to move the alphas forward. There are also 6 competencies. And this is an area where I think this model can really help empower others, because the other models don't do a lot with competencies. When you go into a lot of companies, you see roles and responsibilities defined. But you don't hear as much of a focus on competencies. So the competencies are the abilities needed. We have 5 levels of competencies, which grow from where you're just in the company and you're able to assist, all the way up to you're the guru that can innovate. One of the things I like to say about this, these are 6 essential. We believe these are essential on all software endeavors. You can add other competencies if you feel that there's important ones in your company or your organization. The ones people are most familiar with are development and testing. Most developers are familiar with those. And we've done well through the years with those competencies. The ones we've done less well with are leadership, management, analysis, and stakeholder representation. Those are areas that I think this model can bring more visibility. And I'd just like to mention quick an example of this. A lot of people get confused on leadership versus management. And the way to tell whether you have a leadership or a management problem, if you're using Essence, it's real easy. Because leadership has to do with leading people. Management has to do with managing artifacts, managing things like requirements documents and schedules. Right? So if you're having trouble progressing the work alpha, it's probably a management competency issue. And it really works out well. I use the model now in my own consulting, and I go, okay, we got something going on here. Is this management or leadership? Well, I go back to the work alpha. If we're having trouble with the work alpha, because now it's stuff, so requirements, code, test cases, is that the problem? Or schedules? Or is it the team? Are we having trouble progressing the team, the people? You lead people. If you're having trouble progressing the team alpha, it's probably a leadership competency issue. Yes? What if you can't meet a checklist item? Example, checklist item mechanisms to grow the team in place. What if you were told you can only have 4 people and you're not going to get more? Well, the answer is the team discusses it. Is that important? At least you should know if somebody leaves how you're going to get someone else. What if all team members understand how to perform their work? What if the answer is you got one team member who's new and doesn't perform? This project doesn't stop, so don't think of these things as rigid things. We've got to make sure we hit the team discusses what to do. Well, Joe, I'll mentor you. I'll give you some help. Fine, let's move on. So it gets you to have that conversation. Stakeholder, one of the stakeholder representatives hasn't taken on their responsibilities. What if they don't? The team has the discussion, how important is this stakeholder? If it's an important stakeholder and they're not there, they're not coming to the right meetings, and it's a critical stakeholder, you need to do something. If it's a bit player and he's not really going to affect the real outcome, then you move on. Again, we're giving the team the power to make the decision in the context. This is some common questions. You have multiple choices on how you can address the answers. You discuss it, you take an action, or you discuss it and say it's not applicable to us, or you raise a risk. So that's the way the team's intended to use this. Why isn't, one of the common questions we get is, why isn't risk? Risk is definitely essential. Why don't we have a risk alpha? And the analogy I like to use on this is go back to my example of the dashboard in your car. It's risky business to drive a car, right? Anybody got a car that has a risk indicator? So why don't we have risk indicators in our car on the dashboard?
Because all of those are.
Say again?
Because all of the things on the dashboard are risk indicators.
All of the things are risk indicators. Every alpha, this model is a risk model. Every indicator is a risk model. Because when you get to a checklist item, if it's important and you can't meet it, you got a potential risk. And that's the same thing with the dashboard on your car. When you see that fuel gauge going too low, there's a risk. Or you see the speedometer heading up, 80, you got the red flag. So the risk indicators are everywhere. That's the same reason we don't have risks here, because we have it everywhere. Why is hardware included in the definition of a software alpha? I already mentioned this. This is not a theoretical model. It's a model to help you be successful. Software needs hardware to run on it. We're talking about what you need to be successful in software development, and you need to get the value of software comes from running on hardware. So you see a lot of dependencies in this model. You'll see checklists that don't sound like software engineering, because they're there because they're things that real teams have to deal with to be successful.